Before dawn on Betio, the Pacific did not whisper, it held its breath. A low tide clung stubbornly to the coral, exposing a jagged white shelf that looked less like ocean floor and more like the ribcage of some ancient leviathan. In the trenches behind steel-reinforced seawalls, the Japanese garrison waited. Men of the Special Naval Landing Forces, proud heirs to Bushido and fortified in concrete and coral, peered out over a lagoon they believed was about to become an American graveyard. They had rehearsed this moment in doctrine and faith. Boats would come. Boats would run aground on the reef. Boats would stall in the shallows, their engines screaming and their crews thrashing in chest-deep water under intersecting fire from machine guns, mortars, and coastal artillery. The reef was a natural ally, a razor-backed barrier across nearly 2,000 yards of killing ground. The Imperial officers did not pray for victory, they assumed it by geometry. Then the horizon moved. Not boats, not Higgins' craft with wooden bows and fragile chins. What crawled toward Betio in the dull pre-light were silhouettes wrong enough to be unsettling even at distance squat, humped shapes that did not sit low in the water, but rolled through it. Tracks churned like underwater treads. Spray kicked from armored noses. The American assault was arriving not as boats at all, but as machines that looked like they had swallowed the ocean and decided to chew reefs as an afterthought. Amphibious tractors, LVTs, Amtraks. The first Japanese gun captain to understand what he was seeing did not curse. He hesitated, just long enough that the men around him watched confusion bloom on his face like a wound. Floating tanks? Impossible. Tanks could not swim. Boats could not climb coral under fire. Yet here were steel-skinned shapes sloshing forward with the stubborn inevitability of tectonic plates. The reef did not stop them. On the American transports offshore, Marines braced against salt wind and fear. Men who had trained for years to storm beaches in wooden craft now rode inside machines that smelled of grease and cordite, their hulls riveted like factory boilers and their engines thrumming with mechanized patience. Gunnery Sergeant William Bordelon, who would earn the Medal of Honor that day, later described the feeling. It was like being inside a bulldozer someone dared to drown. The LVT was not elegant. It was industrial contrariness given shape, 70 horsepower engines, driving steel tracks with gator-toothed cleats, sealed transmissions, self-bailing decks, sponsons that trapped buoyancy like stubborn lungs. America had designed a machine not to conquer the ocean, but to shrug at it. It did not rise with the surf. It ignored the surf. As the first wave reached the reef, the machines did not founder. They climbed, steel teeth gripping coral. Gunners inside the Japanese bunkers froze, confronted not with the expected spectacle of stranded Marines, but with mechanical things crawling forward like armored crustaceans. The reef line that planners thought sacred physics suddenly seemed an outdated superstition. In war, revelation is rarely gentle. A Japanese lieutenant, later interrogated after Saipan, remembered the exact moment disbelief curdled into fear. They came over the coral. Not around, not through, over. The ocean was not a barrier, it was their road. The Marines inside the lead Amtraks heard the enemy guns open seconds later. The reef erupted in geysers of white coral and black splash. Machine gun rounds whined like angry hornets across open decks. The air thickened with cordite and salt and death. Yet the Amtraks kept moving, climbing, grinding, refusing to obey the boundaries physics had once set. Where Higgins' boats would have stalled and Marines would have drowned in chest-deep surf, these steel beasts simply kept coming. Tarawa's defenders had dug pillboxes knee-deep in coral and sealed their gun ports with steel shutters. They had calibrated everything fields of fire, overlapping arcs, enfilade zones on the assumption of American vulnerability in the water. But now the water itself betrayed them, carried by armored flotation cells, supported by industrial buoyancy, defeated by torque and gear reduction. Where the ocean was supposed to kill, it delivered. Every second the machines lived, the plan died. A corporal from the 4th Special Naval Landing Force scribbled in a pocket journal before a shell later tore him apart. They are not men landing. They are factories. They float. By the time the first wave hit the beach, the illusion of Japanese mathematical certainty was gone. American Amtraks belched Marines into sand and smoke, some burning, some bleeding, all moving. They brought Browning machine guns, demolition charges, and the implacable confidence of a nation that could take an idea from drafting paper to steel and then multiply it by thousands. The reef, once ally, became indictment. The defenders had trusted rock and tide. The Americans trusted factories in Detroit, design engineers at Food Machinery Corporation, welders in shipyards who had never seen the Pacific but built machines to tame it. The Japanese fired until barrels glowed, but the truth had already crossed the lagoon. Their coastal doctrine had met an enemy that did not accept terrain as fate. Gearboxes had rewritten geography. Engineering had defied tide tables. The ocean, once gatekeeper, had been reduced to a medium the invaders simply traversed. On Tarawa, every coral ridge the defenders counted on as armor became proof instead of American imagination. War had moved from courage to calculus. The Marines still bled, still fell by the hundreds. No machine stopped bullets entirely, but the logic had shifted. Where Japan guarded beaches, America engineered around them. In that damp pre-dawn light, on a reef half a world from Detroit and San Diego, the Pacific War pivoted from fortresses to factories. A sergeant of the Imperial Navy, the last survivor in one bunker, whispered as flames licked through the firing slit, "We trusted the ocean." They brought machines to walk on it. The Amtraks crawled up the beach, tracks biting volcanic sand, engines roaring like steel hearts refusing to drown. They did not look like cavalry. They looked like inevitability. The reef had not saved Betio. It had only taught the defenders a new truth too late to matter. In the industrial war that emerged that morning, nature did not defend nations. Mass and metal did. The Americans had not just crossed the sea. They had engineered victory into the tide. The reef had failed. Now it was doctrine's turn. By mid-morning on Betio, the island did not resemble land so much as a furnace. Oil fires bled black columns into a sky already bruised by naval gunfire residue. Palm trunks stood headless. Concrete bunkers sweated cordite. Smoke dragged low, a choking blanket stitched together by dust, and powdered coral. The ground trembled under the steady percussion of naval 5-inch shells, their explosive rhythm marking time in violence rather than seconds. Yet in the command bunkers beneath the airstrip, Japanese officers did not panic. Panic was dishonor. Panic was weakness. Instead, they experienced something far more corrosive: confusion, in men trained to believe confusion was impossible. Major Shibasaki, commander of the Betio garrison, had declared with absolute certainty, 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. But the million had never needed to come. The Americans brought machines instead. Reports flooded his bunker in choked bursts. Tanks ashore, amphibious vehicles still arriving, enemy advancing across airfield, communications trenches lost. Every runner who stumbled in carried more contradiction than clarity. Shibasaki demanded explanations. None came. He had expected Marines to drown in the lagoon. Instead, they rode forward in armored tractors, then shifted to medium tanks that rolled off barges like steel-skinned beasts eager for violence. The Imperial defense had prepared for men. It found itself fighting an assembly line. At 9:30, 3 American M3 mediums clanked across the sand, their radial engines growling, treads chewing coral, hulls streaked with brine and soot. They were awkward, squat, almost homely, as if someone had taught a boiler to walk. Yet they moved through machine gun fire like creation, refusing permission to die. A Japanese lieutenant screamed a fire order from a bunker lip, voice shredded by salt and terror. "Type 90 gun! Engage the steel boats!" The gun barked. A high-velocity round slammed into a marine tank's hull. The vehicle lurched, belched smoke, paused, then resumed its crawl, turret slewing toward the threat like an insult made of steel. A shell returned the argument, concrete disintegrated, bodies vanished, and the bunker ceased to exist. In the command post, an adjutant whispered, numb, They are ships on land. Shibasaki did not answer. Outside, the battlefield began to tilt physically, psychologically, mathematically. Marines, pinned at the seawall, rose behind bulldozer-snouted Amtraks that had already defied tide and reef. Flame tanks followed, arcs of liquid fire turned bunkers into ovens. Explosive satchels erased defilades. Grenades rolled like punctuation marks at the end of sentences written in coral dust and blood. Japanese gunners watched tanks traverse broken seawalls and could not reconcile theory with sight. Vehicles were not supposed to breach at low tide. Infantry was not supposed to move behind armor on coral, yet both were happening in real time with mechanized certainty. For 2 years, Japanese propagandists had painted Americans as weak, pleasure-soft, incapable of hardship, yet here were Americans crawling through wire, hurling themselves into pits, dragging wounded by their webbing straps, storming pillboxes, with faces blackened not for stealth, but because the island itself burned. Weak nations did not build machines that floated and crawled and burned and crushed. Weak nations did not hammer an atoll flat with naval gunfire, then walk into hell willingly. Weak nations did not industrialize amphibious assault. A young naval ensign in a shattered command trench watched a flame tank roll past shattered palm trunks, its flamethrower erupting in a geyser of orange death across a bunker mouth. He had been taught that spirit beat steel. He now watched steel erase spirit in seconds and leave no room for myth. "Why do they keep coming?" he murmured. A sergeant answered without turning his head, voice glass-hard, "Because they have more machines than we have bullets." By midday, the realization spread bunker to bunker like a rumor, too heavy to carry, yet too undeniable to ignore. The Americans had not merely crossed the reef, they had industrialized crossing. They had not simply brought tanks, they had made them seaworthy. They had not relied on nature, they manufactured advantage. Every Japanese officer on Betio had believed the ocean itself was a defender. The ocean had been out-engineered. At 1100 hours, an observation post message scratched across a field phone line before it went dead. Enemy, using armor like ships, impossible. Impossible. But impossibility lay burning on the reef, and inevitability rolled across the airfield on tracks. In the final hours that day, as Marines fought hand-to-hand among shattered revetments, Japanese officers who had sworn to die stood amid wrecked concrete and flickering flames, realizing their war had turned a corner. Not in Tokyo, not in Washington, but here on a coral speck where the Pacific met American industry and lost. When the sun dipped, it cast long shadows behind smoldering hulks and twisted steel. The reef gleamed, not white but red, brushed by tide and sacrifice. Tarawa was not yet taken, but the belief had been broken, doctrine had drowned, and somewhere beneath that ruin, the first whispers of defeat surfaced not in shame, but in astonishment. The Americans had ridden machines over the ocean. It was not courage alone. It was capability multiplied by steel, patience welded into gearboxes, confidence riveted into hull plates. On Betio, Japan learned a truth it could not unlearn. Steel swims when a nation builds enough of it. Betio Lagoon, Tarawa afternoon, November 1943. By the afternoon of the second day, the turquoise lagoon had turned the color of rusted memory. Oil slicks smeared the surface, splintered timbers drifted like broken teeth, helmeted shapes floated face down in the lazy push and pull of tide. Smoke columns bent in the wind, turning tropical sky into a wounded bruise. The Pacific, which the Japanese had believed their ally, now looked like machinery that had overheated, boiling, steaming, clogged with debris of war. The water was supposed to be Japan's moat. Instead, it had become America's assembly line. The lagoon was no longer an ocean. It was a factory floor, a place where machines did not merely arrive, they cycled. Amtraks crawled in, disgorged Marines under fire, wheeled, reversed, and sloshed back out to fetch more. Higgins boats came where depth permitted, floating tractors came where it did not. Offloading patterns repeated, adjusted, refined, accelerated. Waves came not by chance but by schedule, by logistics, by a rhythm written in tonnage and horsepower and ammunition allotment charts. A Japanese artillery observer scribbled into his notebook beneath a shattered coconut log, "They do not land, they deliver." He meant it literally. American supply officers offshore tracked every tractor, every tank, every amphibian and barge, as if they were conveyor belts in a plant. Spare parts were ready, fuel drums were staged. Radios crackled not in panic, but in the technical cadence of production. Men staging throughput in a hostile warehouse. The front lines bled, the rear lines calculated. Japan had prepared for a charge. They received a process. On the pier line, an Amtrak staggered back to water on tracks smoking from coral abrasion, hull pocked with shrapnel, antenna bent like broken fingers. Sailors met it waist-deep, swarmed it, patched it, reloaded belts of 30 caliber and 50 caliber rounds, topped fuel, slapped the hull twice like a pit crew signal and sent it back into battle. Turnaround, 3 minutes. A corporal on Betio's sea wall, too exhausted to speak, watched another wave surge forward. He whispered to no one, to the ruined world around him. They replace machines faster than we replace men. On the Japanese command network, what little still functioned officers argued over the impossible. How many tanks could be brought over reefs? How many amphibious tractors could a nation build? How many men could a machine shuttle across death again? And again? One staff captain offered the only explanation he could manage. They must have endless factories. Out on the lagoon, a marine sergeant named Harold Dutch Schultz leaned from a tractor's hull, shouting to his crew over the roar of the engine. They had made 6 trips already. The machine stank of diesel, blood, and salt. Bullet holes peppered the superstructure. The bow gunner's face was streaked with salt and soot, but he grinned anyway. There was no poetry in it, just grit and gasoline and repetition. Schultz slapped the armor plating affectionately. "Keep chewing, girl. There's more beach to eat." The tractor responded by lunging forward, metal teeth grinding coral again, hydraulic components complaining in a metallic whine. It was not fast. It was inevitable. The Japanese defenders had counted on courage. They found themselves fighting capacity. At 3:30 in the afternoon, a Japanese bunker commander watched through a periscope as yet another wave of American vehicles crawled through surf. He counted them mechanically 1, 3, 6, 9, until counting felt pointless. Not because the numbers were too high, but because the number did not stop increasing. He lowered the scope and said, voice flat, "We are fighting an ocean made of iron." Behind him, one of his gunners trembled. Not from fear of dying, they had embraced that long ago, but from the unfamiliar sensation of fighting inevitability. His throat was dry when he asked, "Lieutenant, how many of these machines can they possibly have?" The officer answered truthfully, "Enough." When a tank stalled on coral, another pushed behind it like a teammate on a football line. When one burned, crews scrambled clear, and another took its place. When Marines fell, the tractors returned with more. The Japanese shot, and still the line moved forward, imperfect, bloodied, relentless. Marine engineers fought another battle entirely, bridging craters with scrap, bulldozing firing lanes, turning battlefield into logistics yard. Men with wrenches fought beside men with rifles. The lagoon became a choreography of violence and maintenance. Every gear that turned, every piston stroke, every link on every track was proof of a continent-sized industrial will. By evening, Japanese machine gunners were firing not just at Marines, they were firing at motion itself, at rhythm, at the horrifying consistency of a nation that did not attack like an army, but manufactured like an industry. A wounded Imperial officer, dragged from a collapsed pillbox, looked at the never-ending procession of steel over surf and whispered a confession no one would live long enough to hear. "We thought they were merchants. We thought we knew their softness. We never imagined industry could hate this hard." Across the lagoon, Amtraks kept cycling. Tracks clacked. Engines roared. Waves broke around hulls that ignored them. The Pacific was no longer water. It was a conveyor belt, and America rode it to war. Betio seawall and inland bunkers, late afternoon, November 1943. By late afternoon, Tarawa was no longer an island. It was a crucible where metal met salt, where heat gnawed patience and doubt gnawed doctrine. The lagoon had delivered its lesson. Now the seawall became a blackboard for the next one. The Japanese had trusted coral and concrete. The Americans brought steel that could drink the ocean and spit fire. When the first M3 medium tank rolled off an Amtrak ramp and thudded into the surf, Japanese observers blinked. Some shouted warnings. Others simply stared as though witnessing a hallucination carved from dust and engine fumes. A tank here, on the inside of the reef line on an island barely large enough for a runway. Impossible, yet there it was. Its tracks sloshed through tide pools, crushing coral lumps and sandbags alike. Salt water dripped from its hull plates like sweat. A wave slapped its bow, and the machine did not care. The jungle-trained defenders had expected steel to fear surf. Instead, steel arrived soaked, steaming, and hungry. The Japanese commander of a pillbox near the pier shouted to his crew, "Armor cannot swim! Armor cannot swim!" His gunner, terrified and honest, whispered, "Then what is that?" The answer came in 50 caliber punctuation. Marine tanks had been built to taste salt. Their air intakes sat high. Their exhaust curled out like battlefield breath. Their electrical systems sat protected behind gaskets and grease and waterproofing born in Detroit, not in some tropical doctrine school. Their gearboxes had been designed with water as enemy and accomplice. Steel should rust, engines should drown, tracks should seize in sand. But these machines had been built not just to cross land. They had been built to cross doubt. A Japanese petty officer, bleeding from shrapnel, crawled through a trench soaked with seawater and blood. When he looked up, he saw something that shattered him more than any shell. A marine fuel crew, unarmed, bare-chested, splattered with oil, refueling a tank under fire as casually as if topping off a truck at a roadside stand. Bullets snapped overhead. Mortar fragments hissed. One sailor ducked reflexively. The others did not bother. They trusted the machine. They trusted the system. They trusted a nation that viewed war like manufacturing line speed mattered, downtime killed. A tank gunner slapped the turret twice. A signal. The supply crew rolled away, like a conveyor line advancing product. The tank lurched forward, and war resumed. The Japanese petty officer whispered, not in fear but disbelief, "They send mechanics into gunfire, because America could build more machines, and more men trained to keep them alive." In one bunker, a captain of the Special Naval Landing Forces still quoted samurai codes to inspire his men. Spirit conquers iron. He believed it. He had to. Then he heard it. Grinding raw gears, biting coral, armor shrieking as steel chewed sand and bone. A marine flamethrower team followed an Amtrak across a trench line. Fire roared like a furnace cracked open. The captain watched flamethrower arcs paint the air orange, liquid fire clinging to steel shutters. Spirit had not conquered iron. Spirit burned inside iron's shadow. The captain reached for his sword, not to charge but to grip it like an anchor. Pride became weight, not armor. Bushido could not smother mechanization. A Japanese corporal beside him muttered, confused and small, "They do not retreat, they replace. War is not only seen, it is heard." The defenders heard the difference long before they understood it. Marine tanks grinding coral into dust. Amtrak tracks whipping water like chains. Naval guns thundering from beyond horizon. The rhythmic cough of Browning machine guns. And behind it all, the relentless drone of engines cycling supplies. The sound of Tarawa was not battle. It was manufacture. In the dying light, a Japanese radio operator, his headset crackling with broken circuits and static, gasped when tanks rolled closer. "They are factories." His voice cracked. "They brought factories." He tried to transmit coordinates. The line died. So did the idea that Japan's island forts could stop a mechanized republic. By dusk, many Amtraks burned where they sat, flame licking their hulls like hungry spirits. But for every tractor smouldering in the tide, two more crawled forward. For every tank hit, another rolled off a barge. For every marine cut down, another squad sprinted in behind steel. The Japanese still fought with ferocity and discipline. Their courage did not crack. Their weapons did not fail. Their resolve did not melt. But their understanding did. Tarawa taught them a truth that echoed through Pacific Command bunkers. America's war was not human scale. It was machine scale. As stars emerged over a burning lagoon, a single sentence passed among the last defenders, spoken through blood-clogged throats and dust-dry mouths. The ocean did not protect us. No, because the Americans had built machines that breathed salt water and crawled through surf and rolled across reefs like industry-given tracks. Tarawa did not fall in a day, but belief did. And once belief dies, fortresses become tombs. Night did not bring silence to Tarawa. It brought revelation. Darkness rolled over Betio like a funeral cloth, hiding flame glow behind shredded palm stumps, masking bodies in tide pools that whispered as if the dead were breathing. The stars above were ancient, the machines below were new, and in that gulf between eternity and innovation, the Japanese defenders faced a truth their commanders had never prepared them for. The sea was finite, American industry was not. In old Imperial war lectures, the ocean was a fortress. In Tarawa's night, it became a delivery belt. Machines did not rest, they cycled. In the small hours, when the Japanese garrison should have seen exhaustion in their enemy, instead they saw engines pulsing across dark surf Amtraks, ferrying ammunition, dragging wounded, pushing crates of water and fuel. Glow lamps flickered in the lagoon like fireflies trapped inside steel hulls. A sergeant on the Japanese pier line pressed his eye to a periscope and froze. His lungs forgot air. His voice came out a whisper. They are still coming. Another soldier grabbed the periscope, thinking hallucination, strain, madness. He saw silhouettes gliding over water in long columns. Not hundreds, thousands, in the imagination of a man whose world had shrunk to an island's width and a bunker's ceiling. He lowered the scope and murmured, "The ocean belongs to them." Japan's Pacific defense had rested on three pillars. The ocean was wall, the reef was moat, the tide was ally. At Tarawa, all three failed. The Americans had not fought the tide. They engineered around it, not through elegant genius, but stubborn capacity. Industrial repetition, trial and error powered by assembly lines and steel mills, stretching from Pittsburgh to San Diego. A junior Japanese officer wiped blood from his bayonet and said to no one in particular, "They do not beat us with men, they beat us with manufacture." His comrade didn't answer. He couldn't. He stared toward the lagoon, where another line of Amtraks moved like iron insects toward land. American Navy beachmasters stalked the surf like railroad conductors in hell helmets, low flare guns in hand, clipboards sealed in plastic, barking logistics over chaos. "Move that tractor, now! Ammo to Red 3. Get that wounded off corpsman up." They looked less like warriors and more like angry foremen in a blazing factory. Steel screamed, diesel belched, radios coughed coordinates. And above it all, officers and enlisted alike drove the machinery of invasion with the impatience of men who believed time itself could be defeated by planning. One Japanese observer later said under interrogation, "They fought like factories that could bleed." By midnight, Amtrak hulls were pitted and scarred. Tracks squealed against coral dust that chewed metal like hunger. Engines coughed salt mist, yet they kept moving. A mechanic crouched beside a stalled LVT, wrench in one hand, cigarette glowing under his helmet brim. Mortars boomed in the distance. He didn't look up, didn't flinch. He cursed a stripped bolt, hammered it loose, slapped the hull twice. Go. The vehicle rumbled forward into smoke, carrying Marines into more gunfire. The Japanese heard that sound steel resurrected by a grease-stained man who did not have time to die, and learned something ancient nations rarely learn gently. America's courage was mechanical. its persistence engineered. Inside one of the last intact bunkers, Captain Nishioka of the Special Naval Landing Forces knelt over a field map lit by a trembling lantern. His hands shook not with fear, but with the weight of miscalculation. He had believed in reefs, in tides, in spirit over steel. He whispered, jaw clenched against truth, "We built our defense on nature, they built theirs on industry." Around him, young soldiers listened, though he had not meant to teach. They heard defeat not in tone, but in realization. Nature could run out, steel could be forged forever. Outside, American flamethrowers hissed, and another bunker went silent. A corporal leaned close and whispered as if passing a prayer, "Industry does not feel pain." Near dawn, an exhausted Japanese machine gun crew lay prone in the sand, sweat mixing with powder and seawater. They had shot until barrels glowed cherry red. The gunner blinked sand from his eyes as engines growled again from the lagoon. He listened. It sounded like metal breathing, like America inhaling. The loader whispered, voice dusty as coral, "Where do they build so many?" Another. Marine wave formed offshore. Bow waves glinted in faint pre-dawn light. Engines revved. Tracks churned. Steel advanced. The gunner closed his eyes and answered in a voice too tired to hate, "Where we cannot reach." Tarawa was tiny, only a few thousand yards long, narrow as a whisper. Yet by morning it felt smaller. Not because the Americans grew larger, but because they did not diminish. They came in waves not measured in courage, but in logistics, not in honor, but in horsepower, not by sacred oath, but by supply chain. The Japanese had chosen an island to prove will. America chose machines to prove inevitability. And when the two met, the island shrank until it became nothing more than a testbed for a truth the defenders now tasted in blood and salt. The Pacific was not defended by geography. It would be decided by industry. A final radio transmission crackled from a collapsing bunker, voice hollow, resigned, "Tell the homeland." The tide did not fail. It was simply outbuilt. By the third morning, Betio no longer resembled terrain. It looked like a foundry that had tried to eat a jungle. The airstrip was a skeletal scar of scorched sandbags and twisted steel. Palm stumps stood like bayonets driven into ash. Seawater steamed where incendiaries had kissed it. The air itself felt metallic, every breath a taste of rust, cordite, and annihilation. And through this man-made wasteland, the Americans did something the Japanese defenders had not prepared for. They reorganized. Under fire, under heat, under exhaustion. Machines groaned, crews swapped parts. Supplies flowed like blood through arteries made not of roads but of plan. Tarawa was not just being fought, it was being processed. On the eastern beachhead, a squad of Marines huddled behind a half-sunken bulldozer that still idled, engine coughing like a smoker in winter. The dozer operator, face black with oil, wiped sweat from his brow and yelled at infantry who tried to help him. "Out of the way! I got to clear a supply lane!" A corporal blinked. A supply lane, on a battlefield, not just a breach, not just a foothold, infrastructure under fire. Behind them, Navy Seabees waded in waist-deep surf, dragging metal matting, laying it down like priests spreading holy cloth. Only these priests wielded sledgehammers and grease guns. They built piers of corrugated steel right into bullet-kissed shallows. A Japanese sniper cracked a shot. A Seabee flinched but didn't stop hammering. Steel plates clanged. Tracks rattled. Engines revved behind them, waiting for their turn. War had rules in Imperial doctrine: seize ground, hold ground, force enemy to bleed for inches. But the Americans did not merely seize ground. They converted it instantly into throughput. A Japanese lieutenant, peering through a shattered firing slit, felt the first splintering of his worldview. He watched Marines pull phone wire through a blasted trench. He watched engineers dig, anti-sniper pits, while signalmen erected antennas. He whispered, scarcely believing, "They are not fighting for ground, they are building a system." His gunner stared, unable to process, and muttered, "Factories, factories everywhere." At the lagoon edge, another Amtrak came grinding through surf, bow dented, smoke belching from a cracked exhaust. Two Marines clung to its hull, one dragging a bandaged leg, the other clutching a radio handset against his chest like a newborn. A beachmaster waved them forward with urgency that bordered on fury. "Machine guns up there, move, move, move. Next wave behind you. Next wave. Always a next wave." In Japanese planning, the first assault was decisive. In American execution, the 10th wave was expected. Not a gamble, a schedule. A young Japanese conscript, trembling behind a sand berm, tried to make sense of it. "They do not stop to breathe." His sergeant answered, voice hollow. "They do not invade by courage. They invade by continuation." Betio's defenders had been told the island was sacred, every inch a promise of empire, every bunker a shrine of resolve. Then they watched Americans bulldoze shrines under tracks, engineer trenches across sacred earth, drop sandbags into shell holes and call it a loading zone. Spiritual war met supply chain war. The gods of tradition bowed to hydraulic fluid and torque curves. Major Shigenori, a veteran of Shanghai and Java, stared across the airfield as American tractors dragged fuel drums and crates past wrecked Type 95 light tanks. His hand trembled on his Nambu pistol grip. This was not the war he had been trained to command. This was not spear versus spear. This was assembly line versus faith. He gasped to his adjutant. They mass-produce war. Every Japanese pillbox that fell revealed the same scene. Maps marked by reefs and shoals, machine gun belts stacked like offerings, grenades laid out in perfect ritual rows, and always the same fatal miscalculation. The belief that natural barriers trumped industrial imagination. One bunker held a chalkboard with tide charts meticulously plotted. Next to it, an American engineer's body lay slumped over a diffused mine, wrenches still in hand. Nature versus manufacture. The tide chart was wrong, the wrench was right. In the deepest command shelter still intact, a Japanese captain listened as a shaken runner delivered a message. "Amtrak's inland, tanks inland, they are everywhere." The captain asked the only question that mattered: how many remain? The runner swallowed hard. "They do not remain, they arrive." The bunker fell silent. War had shifted from possession to replacement, from honor to volume, from bloodline duty to supply line certainty. The captain closed his eyes. Not in prayer, in realization. We did not prepare to fight a nation, we prepared to fight an army. Across the central causeway, Marines stacked ammo crates into makeshift barricades, then tore them down minutes later to feed machine guns snarling at enemy counterattacks. Engineers mapped kill zones, medics triaged, tank crews repaired track links while shells whistled overhead. The battlefield never paused, only shifted tasks. A Marine lieutenant, voice hoarse, shouted mid-firefight, "Clear that jam, we gotta feed the boys on Red 2. Feed the boys, feed the guns, feed the machines." Tarawa wasn't won by a glorious charge. It was manufactured in place. By late morning, Imperial holdouts crouched behind rubble, watching another column of Amtraks churn forward. Some bowed their heads. Some cursed. One whispered a line that would later surface in interrogation records. "They have more engines than we have prayers." Above them, an American plane droned, scouting next targets, already planning the next landing, the next island, the next reef to out-engineer. The Pacific had belonged to nature, now it belonged to output, and Tarawa, tiny, blood-soaked Tarawa, had become the place where Japan discovered the most terrifying weapon of the modern age. Not bombs, not ships, not tanks, repetition. A war not of heroes but of capacity. Betio night, November toward dawn, 1943. 900 words. Night on Betio did not fall so much as collapse. A brutal blackout, smothering firelit smoke and the metallic aftertaste of cordite and salt. What passed for darkness on that island was not silence, not peace, not rest. It was motion. Marines did not sleep. Japanese soldiers did not surrender. Machines, wounded and snarling, did not cool. and beyond the reef beneath waves slick with fuel and blood Amtrak still came. The Japanese had learned by now what that meant. Night no longer belonged to them. On paper, their tide and reef calculations had been flawless. Low tide here, sandbar here, reef teeth sharp as saw blades, artillery zones converging like scissors, machine gun, arcs overlapping. The ocean itself enlisted as a defensive weapon, then reality betrayed theory. Now, in darkness broken by tracer arcs, the reef functioned not as a barrier, but as a docking platform. Amtraks clattered over coral ridges like factory carts running on a belt, loading, unloading, returning, repeating. One Japanese lieutenant, delirious from blood loss, whispered to a medic who could not save him. "We built an island fortress." They brought a factory. On the beachhead, Marines laboured with the grim discipline of men doing a job, not waging glory. Ammo crates cracked open, barbed wire reeled into place, water cans stacked, radios recalibrated, machine gun barrels swapped corpsmen, triaged by flickering red lens light, smell, diesel, copper, sweat, scorched coconut wood, wet canvas, and fear held down by will. Someone boiled coffee in a helmet. Someone else sharpened an entrenching tool on coral, edge catching sparks like flint. Everything had sound, metallic, grinding, purposeful. Japanese ears, tuned to jungle stealth and bayonet whispers, heard something alien. Industry in miniature, a supply chain breathing. Japanese squads tried infiltrating shoreline positions, moving through black coral and burned palms. They expected chaos. They expected fear. What they found were Marines operating like machinists on a night shift. Trip flares like welding sparks, claymores improvised from satchel charges and nails, rifle fire measured, not frantic, flamethrower bursts lighting bunkers like smelter furnaces, grenades thrown not in panic but in cadence. A Japanese corporal peeked over a sand ridge and froze as he saw Americans repairing a damaged radio under fire. They did not flinch. They did not argue. They soldered wires with tanks rumbling behind them. He whispered, "They fix things in combat. Not patches, not improvisations, reconstruction." In this moment he understood. The Americans did not simply have equipment. They maintained it even under bayonet range pressure. Past midnight, Seabees arrived bearded, filthy, grinning like men born for chaos. They swung picks, dropped steel matting, hammered coral, laid fuel lines. One worked while a sniper round shaved bark from a shattered palm beside him. He did not duck. He simply muttered, "Shoot straight, you Navy son of a hand me that damn wrench." He tightened a bolt as if that act held the Pacific together, and in a sense, it did. Drums rolled across sand like iron prayer wheels. Fuel lines hissed. A bulldozer, scarred and loud, crawled forward and sank into a crater, then rose again, exhaust coughing flame. Japanese officers watching from a ruined trench could not fathom it. In their world, engines were precious, spiritual, coaxed, protected. Here, engines were consumed. A Japanese major wiped ash from his eyes and hissed, "They burn machines like incense." Another officer answered, voice trembling, "They worship, not the emperor, but the engine." Near the southeastern pocket, a final banzai probe surged through darkness, men running low, bayonets forward, voices raw and teeth bared. They struck barbed wire, grenades, and a Marine squad crouched behind sand and broken steel. Then, unexpectedly, a bulldozer engine roared back to life behind the Marines. Its blade lowered. It moved forward, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. Bayonets met steel. Men screamed. The war crushed bones like branches. A Marine sergeant, eyes hollow, said, "War ain't honor, kid. It's talk." Before sunrise, the Japanese made one last attempt to signal radio command. Static answered. Their artillery officers lay silent. Their commanding bunkers burned. One exhausted Japanese runner delivered the final message ever transmitted from Betio's inland defense posts. "The enemy refuels in hell. We cannot stop a nation that does not sleep." At dawn, the reef shimmered pink, not from peace, but exhaustion. Amtraks still moved, tanks idled, Seabees laid track, Marines checked rifles and drank bitter coffee. Nothing heroic in posture, just readiness. Across the lagoon, a few Japanese soldiers stared, eyes sunken, jaws clenched. They had not been defeated solely by Marines. They had been defeated by grease guns, spare parts, fuel lines, carburetors, track, tension bolts, logistics, timetables, the boring, sublime cruelty of efficiency. Betio was no longer a battlefield. It was a factory line that had consumed its defenders, and the factory never stopped. Decades later, a Japanese survivor would whisper to an interviewer, voice trembling with memory, "We expected warriors. We faced workers. And their work was death." He paused, then added, "We did not lose to courage. We lost to capacity." Tarawa's reef did not fail Japan. Japan failed to imagine a country capable of floating Detroit across the Pacific, one Amtrak at a time.